Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. In September, the public schools in the United States celebrates Constitution Day to honor our national charter dating to 1787. With me today to talk about the Constitution and how it came to be written is John Robertson, retired professor of history at the college, as well as an author and historian. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
We could, of course, go on for hours and hours and hours about this, but we only have 30 minutes. And, of course, it's difficult for historians to be brief, but we'll do the best we can. Let's set the background for the Grand Convention of 1787. Why did the founders feel the need to come up with this new form of government?
This is a period in history is frequently called the critical period, simply because the government that existed under the Articles of Confederation did not seem to be able to cope. In fact, at one point, we almost went back to war with England because nobody was present so they could ratify the treaty. They had to take the treaty to a person who was sick and he was in his bed, and they took Congress to him and got the final signature. So I think it was that, as much as anything, the recognition that they had created this government. It did not work, and there was no way under the government to correct it.
Mm-hmm. Of course, under the Articles of Confederation, the real power is vested in the states. And I think the thing that intrigues me about this period is today we think of what you might call American-ness, that we're Americans first, then Democrats, Republicans, Kentuckians, and so on. But at this time, you're more loyal to Virginia or Pennsylvania, aren't you, than to the nation as a whole?
Oh, surely. They were unaccustomed to even thinking together until fairly, 1774, 75. So this is a new experience for them. And as colonies, they were oftentimes much closer in contact with England than they were with their neighbors.
Right. And the article, explain how the articles were set up.
Well, the Second Continental Congress, with all 13 colonies represented, met right after the fighting started at Lexington and Concord. And so it organized for business and actually was the government of the United States. But then it was just a loose organization, and they needed more structure. So in, as I remember, June of 1776, a committee was formed, headed by John Dickinson, as I remember. But anyhow, it was to come up with a definition of a government. And they did, reported it back, and there was one of the colonies, Maryland, who had a fixed western boundary. And so if it went in as it was structured, Maryland would have no claim to western lands. So it refused to ratify this new Articles of Confederation until, starting with Virginia, colonies with claims to western lands agreed to give those to the central government in exchange for the creation of the government. And this was done, and finally, when it came into existence, it's completely different from what we think of as a central government. There was only one thing, it was Congress. Each state had one vote, and you had to have 9 votes to pass normal business, which is almost unheard of today, and you had to have all 13 colonies in agreement to amend or to change the government. So once it was created, it was, like the old man of the sea that gets on your back, you can't get him off until you agree to get somebody else take him up.
One of the persistent stories that comes around is that George Washington was not the first president of the United States, that a man named John Hanson was. And of course, it's kind of a funny urban legend, and I suppose. And that's because Hanson was president of Congress?
The Congress, when it met to organize for business, elected one person as the presiding officer. That was his function. He had no veto power as our presidents have. He was just a
parliamentarian.
A functionary. And I think there were 7 or 8 before the present government came into existence. And so as presidents of the Continental Congress, they were just tokens.
And of course, again, and I think everyone who grows up in the United States, you memorize the three branches of government almost like a mantra, you know, executive, legislative, and judicial. Under the Articles, it was strictly the legislative branch, and that's all.
Well, it also served as the Supreme Court.
Right.
So it had that function as well. It was both, or all functions. And despite its great weaknesses, it actually passes some things of major importance. The Land Act of 1785, everything except Kentucky and those with the Virginia tradition in the westward movement followed the pattern of the Land Act, which sets up in townships, sections, and ranges. And strangely enough, only one part of Kentucky was settled in that fashion.
And
that's where we are,
right.
the Jackson Purchase.
And it's fun to point that out to students. If you look at a map of Kentucky, the Purchase counties have very straight lines, as opposed to, say, Woodford County and some of those squiggly counties up there. And you cross the river into Illinois and notice how straight the roads that run at right angles. And if you fly over Illinois in a plane, you can see that in the field. So yes, absolutely correct. Yeah, that's a very important part.
And the other thing they passed of equal importance, if not more, was the Northwest Ordinance, 1787, which was the beginning of the transition from frontier to statehood. And previous to that, nobody knew how to do it. Kentucky tried 10 times to get in.
Right.
And couldn't do it. But under that ordinance, it was all based upon stages of growth based upon population. So they did remarkably well.
Absolutely.
They won the war, they made the peace, but they just couldn't govern the country.
Right, right. So the delegates meet in Philadelphia. They're instructed to change the Articles, to amend the Articles, to tweak them, to make them better, and they wind up creating a whole new form of government. Federalism. What were the ideas behind that?
Well, it goes back to Montesquieu's esprit de law. The idea that, well, as Governor Morris would say, that power and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we have to have a balance of power. You give power to one branch, you have to offset that with equal power elsewhere.
Checks and balances.
Checks and balances system. Also, the government is a republic, not a democracy. And even today, we common people never vote for the President of the United States.
Right.
It's always done through a representative.
Elector.
The electors, right. So it was all of those ideas going back to Locke and to Hobbes and Montesquieu combined form the philosophical basis for our government. And of course, it was new. And when we got ours, we became the beginning of a movement that spread around the world to overthrow the existing governments and the monarchs and replace them with elected government, representative government.
When the delegates arrived in Philadelphia, I believe 55 of them, representing the 13 states.
55 attended, more were appointed.
Right. There, one of the, I guess, the biggest stumbling block was representation in this new legislature. Going back to, as you said, about the Articles, each state got one vote. If you're from New York or to say Virginia, you think maybe that's a better idea to represent it based on population. If you're from Delaware, Rhode Island, it's a good idea. So this was a major bone of contention, was it not?
Well, Virginia is 16 times more populated than Delaware.
Right.
So they thought they should have 16 times more votes.
And Delaware strenuously objected to that.
Yeah, oh yes, very definitely. And so did New Jersey. And in fact, New Jersey came up with an alternative plan.
Right.
The thing there was when they finally met and got out into business, one state came with a program. That was Virginia. And so Virginia presented their plan, which had, a president, and it had a Congress, and it had a Supreme Court. So they presented a specific program where a population would determine one's power in the government. And then the alternate plan was the New Jersey plan, which was the Articles given the power to do more.
Right.
Like tax was the big thing.
And this caused quite heated debate, did it not?
You know, we don't know anything about that for 20 years. If you read the official records of what happened, they went to great lengths to not let anybody know.
Oh, absolutely.
They
It was
met in
all
secrecy.
secret. Yeah.
They would not discuss, even in the taverns,
Right.
the Queen's Tavern and the London pubs, and all of those where the delegates stayed. And one man got out in front and took extensive notes. He made almost shorthand transcriptions, and that was James Madison. And we didn't get a copy of what went on until Madison died and donated his papers to what became the Library of Congress. But you're right, there was heated debates over this, and the one big thing had to be resolved before anything else could be. And fortunately, Roger Sherman from Connecticut comes in and offers the Grand Compromise.
Right, right. Which is the upper house based on 2 senators per state, the lower house based on population. And isn't compromise sort of the lifeblood of American politics?
It always has been, dating really from this. If you think about it, though, there's also a statement in here of our concept of structure of society, because the Senate was not to be elected by popular vote. The Senate, which was the more mature, the upper class representatives protecting the aristocracy, they were to be elected by the state legislatures, which in turn were elected themselves.
Right.
And that stays until the 17th Amendment to the Constitution.
Right, right.
While we had to let the public be represented, but these people were conservative. They were much older than the people who had been in the first and second Continental Congresses. I think the average age is 42. 81 for Benjamin Franklin, 26 for Jonathan Dryden. But they were willing to give the people a voice in the government, but not directly. In fact, the whole idea of representative government is to prevent the mobocracy that they feared as much as anything else.
Right, right. In fact, a lot of them consider democracy a bad thing.
Oh, yes. They had Shays' Rebellion men going on in Massachusetts. They were afraid of the public.
Of course, the upper house, and again, this goes in line with what you're saying, this august upper house is the Senate, named for the Roman Senate, and the lower house, the more mundane House of Representatives. Getting around to electing the president, and I'm like you, I love to tell my class, I said, if you voted in the last presidential election, no one here in this room voted for George Bush, and they'll look at me like, and I said, you voted for an elector.
Right.
Explain how that rather cumbersome system works.
Well, each state elects electors that go to a collegiate meeting where they cast the votes of their particular state, which is based upon population. That's the Virginia idea, and then each state having 2 votes.
So your number of electoral votes equals your members of Congress plus your 2 senators.
Right. Well, members of Congress, period.
Right, exactly, yeah.
100 for the Senate and...
right.
You could even see that social structure based on how long they serve. Senators serve 6 years.
As opposed
the people's government,
2 years.
Let's get them out quickly.
That's right.
2 years.
That's right. Yeah.
And the presidents don't matter much, so we'll make it 4.
Right. And a federal court system. Again, it's a structured system from appellate courts all the way to the Supreme Court. That was this was all new. This whole.
Yeah, but in that you also see this idea of state. Each state was to have 1 court, which would be a district court. And so there'd be 13 district courts. There was to be a court of appeals, 6 members from the Supreme Court would meet with the delegate of the area, and then you would have the Supreme Court. It was all structured much like the people have very little say-so in it. It's to be aloof and removed.
Now, of course, with regard to the judiciary, that sort of brings up 2 ways of looking. In Kentucky, we elect all of our judges from district judge to the state Supreme Court. whereas federal judges are appointed for life. And that's sort of the debate, how insulated the judiciary should be.
But there is a check upon that. The president has the power to appoint members of his own cabinet,
Right.
Ambassadors, members of the judiciary, but in each case there's a check. That appointment has to be confirmed, not by the mob's representatives, but by the
Senate.
members of the Senate.
Right, exactly, and that's indeed a check and balance. And also, you think of another, with the case, a president can be impeached, can be taken out by the Congress.
They can be impeached and they can be...
And turned out of office,
Yeah,
which of
two
course is
different things.
two different things, exactly right. And you think of the idea that a president can veto, but then Congress can override the veto. So this whole idea of checks and balances is...
And that was not complete until 1800, because in 1800 the Supreme Court finally gets the power by that beautiful case of Marbury versus Madison,
Judicial review.
which had nothing to do with a case of law, but it was strictly political. It brought in the idea that after everything else is done, the Supreme Court can overturn acts
The
of
ultimate
Congress.
umpire, referee,
Ultimate
if you
umpire.
will. Who were some of the prime movers in the Constitutional Convention? Ben Franklin obviously was the elder statesman.
He welcomed them. He was the presiding officer the first day. Then, remarkably, they got together and chose unanimously the person who was to preside for all of the other sessions, George Washington.
Of course, who else?
But he spoke very little. Now, to speak, what would happen when they would meet? And we get all of this by reading the minutes of Madison. They would meet, and then Washington would turn the meeting into a committee of the whole, and they would appoint a temporary seat who would occupy the presiding officer's chair, and then Washington could take part in the debates. And what they had to have, so, this maneuvering we're not accustomed to today, but they did it. And none of this was ever reported. People didn't know what went on in the government, which helped get the government passed later.
Of course, another character is Gouverneur Morris, the limping Lothario, as he was called.
Yes, he had one leg, but he was known for leaping out of women's bedrooms and running away
and was quite
on
a
one leg.
character. And by the way, in the Constitution Center in Philadelphia, we were there last summer, and they have all of the founders in bronze, and there is Gouverneur Morris with his pegged leg, and it's fascinating.
He wrote the final draft of the Constitution.
Yes.
It's in his handwriting.
Yes, he was quite a character. So that's one for our viewers for further reading. Read something on.
But he didn't agree with it after it was through.
Right, but fascinating character indeed. Ben Franklin was observing a sun carved on the back of Washington's chair.
Still there.
And it's still there. And tell that story about how Franklin contemplated this sun throughout these
So every
proceedings.
morning he'd look at it and wonder whether the sun, which represented the fate of the nation, was it rising or setting.
And in the end, I think he concluded it was rising. He was happy to conclude that
Yes.
at that point. Any other delegates that are interesting, worth
Well,
mentioning?
Roger Sherman, of course, is a little eccentric. William Few from Georgia, the only one to attend from Georgia, never said a word, and the only farmer present. And you'd like to know what he thought, but there's no record of what he said. So,
and you think of Roger Sherman, his compromise saved the day.
It did.
But yet he's not as well known, I guess, as a founder as some of the others are.
Well, the most interesting delegate is one who had no official standing during the convention. New York had 3 delegates, Lansing, Yates, and Hamilton. And to vote, you had to have a majority of your delegates to vote for the state. Now, Lansing and Yates went there with the understanding they were going to revise the articles. When they found out they were going to go more than that, they left.
Right.
And so New York never voted during the convention. But they went back and began to propagandize against what was going on. And here's the beginning of those who are for it or against it, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists.
Right. And of course, that brings up the point is once the document is signed in September of 1787, it has to be approved by the states.
And this is so vitally important because It was approved. Now, we have to be very careful here. It was never voted on by the Articles of Confederation
Right.
government.
Right.
This is a revolution.
Yes.
This is the second revolution.
Yes.
This is the
Yes.
conservative revolution. So they suggested that the states look at it. And so what you had was each state elected delegates for one purpose, to meet and vote on only one idea, to ratify or not to ratify the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, it goes back to the idea of the social contract of John Locke, that the governed because they gave consent for the government to represent them. And if the government doesn't represent them, they have a legal right to revoke.
Mm-hmm.
So by presenting it to the elected delegates, they were having the people give assent. And by the way, when 9 states ratified, it was in.
Mm-hmm.
And the trouble was the big states that were going to make it work or not were not the first 9 to ratify.
Now, the Anti-Federalists, so-called, had a problem with the document. It lacked a Bill of Rights.
It did not protect.
Why did they want the written Bill of Rights? Because
Because-
didn't the Federalists say, well, it's implied in there?
Yes, and the British to this day have an unwritten constitution.
Exactly.
But just like the right to a trial by jury, there's no place where it says that that is one of the rights. So this government was to be so powerful that they were afraid of it. And so now this is one of the things that Virginia suggested, and that Madison assured that he would carry through, that if they would go ahead and ratify the government, he would see to it that in the first order of business, after they organized, and that brings a wild hair in my mind. Do you know the government of the United States, the first part of it that organized for business was the House?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what date that was? That explains the whole government of the United States. They chose to organize it on April the 1st.
I was going to guess April Fool's Day.
Well, anyhow, when the government finally organized and met, he introduces these compromises guaranteeing the right to assemble, the right to a speedy trial, which God knows whatever happened to that. All of these things that we take for granted, and they are included in the first 10 amendments.
And I think a lot of people think that's a part of the original charter
No.
when they're not.
It was the...
They're so important.
And there were 2 others that were ratified, as I remember it, that presented to the states and have never been rejected. They're still floating around.
Right. Right.
But there were 17 by the Senate and 15 by the House, and I think they finally got around to compromising and ratified 10 of them.
Mm-hmm. So it's easy to see what James Madison's called the father of the Constitution.
Oh, yes.
His handprints are all over it. But again, I guess going back, one of the things that amazes me about, well, today, if you and I are going to do something, we can look it up in a book or we can do a Google search and find it. These folks were making this government from scratch.
Yes. And James Madison was perhaps one of the best educated people in the world on the art of government. And he just happened to be a Virginia delegate. And when a question would come up, they would refer to him for his knowledge of previous experience, like the Dutch Republic, like the famous Republic in Rome, go back to Greece, Athens in particular, not Sparta. But
No. Yeah.
so he was looked upon. But George Wythe was there from Virginia. And you have major scholars involved.
Mm-hmm.
The Virginia delegation came loaded for bear, a formidable group.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were sort of the driving force, and everybody else either agreed with them or tried to oppose them. So they divided early into the 2 camps.
Mm-hmm.
And even though Randolph, the young governor of Virginia, was the official spokesman, the person who carried the weight in Virginia was not George Washington, although he was there. It was Jamie Madison.
Yes, James Madison. It certainly was. Where did Madison get this? Where did he get this education? Just reading on his own?
Reading on his own, and he was sickly as a young person throughout his life. Well, one person called him a dried little apple twist.
Yes, little Jimmy Applejohn, the little apple doll. Right. He was a tiny man,
Tiny
wasn't
man.
he? Yes.
Well, compared to his wife, Dolly is, well, the closest thing to her would be Dolly Parton. She was formidable in appearance. Her inauguration dress is on view at the Smithsonian. You might want to check the measurements. But she was a delightful lady who was sort of the head of society in the Capitol for a long period of time, particularly after Washington left. See, Washington, the first government was met in New York City. And Jamie Madison becomes the first person, no, John Adams was there, but he became the first one to...
There's a wonderful picture in one of our old textbooks that shows them hanging out washing inside one of the unfinished rooms.
That's Abigail, and that was the East Room.
In the Executive Mansion, not the White House yet. The British had something to do with that in the War of 1812, but that's getting ahead of ourselves here. And again, to do this from scratch, and what's fascinating to me is, would it be correct to say that these delegates overstepped their authority in doing this? They were told to tweak the articles. So, in essence, they didn't do what their states told them to do.
And that's why I called it a revolution. And John Adams said the American Revolution started in the mind. And this completes it, because we had won our freedom from England, but now we had to win our freedom from ourselves. We were harnessed in by that government we created. It took 13 states to correct any error in the Articles of Confederation. And one state was not even attending. Rhode Island withdrew. And Rhode Island may have been actually functioning as a de facto nation.
A republic, the Republic of Rhode Island.
The Republic of Rhode Island, because it was putting taxes on other states. So this is all the mess they had to deal with. And they felt the only way they could do it was just throw the old thing away and start over, which they did. But their actions had to be confirmed by the people, the consent of the governed.
And it is sort of out of this struggle between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists that political parties eventually will emerge.
And that is what Washington thought would be the death of the government.
The abomination.
The abomination.
Of political
the
parties.
idea of political partisanship of parties. And yet it's the only thing that makes the government work. It's too cumbersome otherwise.
Yeah. Well, we're out of time. I enjoyed this thoroughly. Thank you for coming to the show. We'll have you back again on maybe another topic. I'm Barry Craig. My guest today was John Robertson. Our topic was the Constitution. Please join us next time. Thanks.